Hello and welcome everybody to another NAFS Research and Tech Talk. I'm really excited to have everybody with us today. If you are watching with us live today, I hope you will use the chat feature in whatever platform you're using to log in and pose some questions. I can see everything you're putting forward to the group in my feed, and I hope that you will speak up, make this a conversation. We have an amazing group of guests today, and I'm going to read a couple of bios, actually 4 bios pretty quickly, but I'm going to do it as quickly as I can. If you are joining the talk after the fact, check out the links above me on YouTube and elsewhere for connections to NAF's Research and Tech Talk playlist, where you can find other interesting talks like this. We also share on the NAF group page on YouTube, as well as NAF's educator page on Facebook. And last but not least, I want to have you, I will put a link in the chat, but if you're on LinkedIn, check out the NAF Research and Tech LinkedIn page for, we do things like share research. We'll give you updates from the NAF network. We will also link to other exciting work that's happening out there in the field. And always the recordings that come out of these talks will go up on LinkedIn in that page. So thank you so much for being here. I am incredibly excited to be talking to you about this book that I have been pretty deep into over the last couple of months. We're here to talk today to 4 incredible authors of 5 practices for equity-focused school leadership. And I'm just going to introduce them fairly quickly and then get into this conversation. First up is Sharon Radd. Sharon is program director and associate professor of organizational leadership at St. Catherine University. She's principal at Conscious Praxis and an equity fellow for the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center at IUPUI. A lot of letters, Sharon. It's so great to see you, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark. Great to be here.
Next up, I have Gretchen Givens Generett. Dr. Givens Generett leads the School of Education as interim dean, has spent the last 15 years in academia researching and teaching on issues of teacher professional development, educational leadership, and cultural diversity. She is a professor in the School of Education at Duquesne. Dr. Generett is in the Foundations of Educational Leadership Department, and she is the university's Noble J. Dick Endowed Chair in Community Outreach. Gretchen, where are you? Let me see. I got you here.
Do you see me?
Gretchen,
Hi.
it's so good to see you.
It's good to see you, Mark. Good to see you.
This is something of a reunion for you and I, and I can't be more excited to have you here to chat with NAFS Network and everybody else who's joined us today.
Yes, the feeling is mutual. Great to be here.
So I am going to give a quick intro to your co-author, Marc Anthony Gooden. I got a lot of controls here, guys. 4 guests at once is a new one for me. Marc Anthony Gooden is the Christian Johnson Endeavor Professor in Education Leadership and Director of the Endeavor Anti-Racist and Restorative Leadership Initiative, EARLI, early in the Department of Organization and Leadership at Teachers College, Columbia University. Marc, welcome, and I am so excited that you're here today.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that.
And last but not least, George Theoharis is a professor of teaching and leadership at Syracuse University. He has extensive experience as a school principal and teacher at Syracuse. He previously served as department chair, associate dean for urban partnerships, and director of field relations. Dr. Theoharis, Great to have you here.
Mark, thanks for having us. It's great to be here with this lovely group of colleagues of mine.
Man, agreed, 100%. So again, if you're just joining us, we're talking about the 5 practices for equity-focused school leadership. And the authors are joining me here today. And I feel like one of us is an absolute wizard of all things scheduling to get 5 of us, but the 4 of you here at one time, I feel like I hit the lottery a little bit. So these were just parts of the resume for each of you. And I am going to actually go off camera in a bit, but I want to get us started and talk a little bit about the book. There are a lot of ways to jump into this topic, but one of the things I really wanted to do, and I'm going to start with you, Gretchen.
Mm-hmm.
I want to celebrate this book.
Yeah.
This is, I think, a topic, anyone who's working in this space who cares a lot about their practice and their work right now is doing a lot of thinking about this topic. Hopefully you have been for a very long time. But this last year is an important moment that we're having. And I feel like it is very easy for us to get into a tough and somber place, place where there's lots of tension. And those are not bad things. We're calling each other into those spaces, and we're having a lot of really meaningful dialogue. And I hope it's okay that I want to start off instead with some celebration. Celebration that we're having this conversation, that the 4 of you, a really unique group of authors, are together for it. And that we have resources like this that are getting into the hands of educators and education leadership. And I'm really interested to start with how this group came together. I want to congratulate you all, and then just ask you and your colleagues, how did the group come together? And this feels like a sort of a magical partnership.
Yeah, well, I feel really privileged to start off with my understanding of how we came together. I think we have lots of connections, but we entered into this relationship not to write the book, right? We entered into the relationship because we were doing work in our individual places. And we have been doing this work for a long time, each of us. And we wanted to figure out how to do it better. And so in coming together as colleagues, it was about how do we learn from each other? How do we support each other? How do we do a better job of attempting to do this work in our individual spaces? And so we just started out talking. And me personally, I met Mark first doing some work through one of our national organizations, UCEA, which is the University Council for Educational Administration. And in working with Mark, he introduced me to Sharon, who then introduced me to George. And it was just a powerful synergy around doing equity work and how to go into schools and how to do that work more effectively and more to have better results. And doing that, meaning us coming together and having those conversations, was for me kind of like water. It was a source of life in a lot of ways for me personally, and it made me better in my individual space. But the conversations were the kind of conversations where we connected around the themes, primarily around the barriers that we experienced doing the work. And from that identification of barriers, we decided to write a book that would help support educators, school leaders, in their efforts so that we could be more effective in our supports of them.
Sharon, I wanted to actually invite you into this conversation. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you.
And I wanted to just hear your reflections on that question of how this group came together and what it's meant for you.
Yeah, so for me, the group has been so powerful, very similar to what Gretchen said, in the way that over time, how our conversations have grown in their depth and their openness, and through that, the trust that we've shared with one another and the trust that we've grown, resulting obviously in this book that we think is powerful and very useful for schools, but also in these really powerful relationships between us. I wanted to be a part of this group because of my experience in K-12, which was 23 years long, most of it as a school administrator, and a lot of it really working hard to try to create more educational equity, and feeling really, really challenged by that, and having very few resources to turn to that really spoke to the unique practice of leadership for educational equity. So I got a good education, getting my principal's license, and getting a doctorate in educational leadership, and studied critical topics in that education, and had lots of really great mentors. But there were few people who were really thinking deeply about how we create change that's really specifically towards educational equity, in my experiences. And as Gretchen said, how, few people that were doing this effectively and really getting results that we wanted to replicate. And so I saw this group as an opportunity for us to learn from one another and to create tools that could be useful for other school leaders in the field towards that end.
It's great. I'm going to invite a couple of your co-authors on here for this next question. So one of the fun parts of getting to do the sort of pre-production for a talk like this is we get to have a little bit of chat back and forth online. And one of the things, Sharon, we were exchanging notes about is you made the interesting point that once the group came together, there was the book, but there was also, in your quotes, the powerful example of the deep, close, committed relationships that we developed among ourselves, something that is pretty rare among people of different races and genders. And my words, not yours, are, and I would say in maybe too many cases, among education leadership. Can you say more about that? And I was hoping that maybe your co-authors would have some things to say about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, I think that says it. I think that it's very hard, particularly across lines of race. It's very hard to step into really full, authentic relationships that are fully open and that remain committed over time, that can talk about issues of race in particular. And so we did that. And there were times when I asked questions and I was afraid to do so, or said, what do you think about this? And I was afraid because I thought that's a risk, but I also, and I didn't want to offend anybody, I didn't want to hurt anybody, and I didn't want to lose these relationships. But I also thought that having those conversations where we took a step further into inquiry and listening to one another and learning from one another, again, not only produced a great book, but really allowed us to have an understanding of each other and race, and for, at least for me as a white person, race and equity in a way that I would not have had I not been in this group. And I'm going to turn over to other people to say more.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I think over time we've grown, and having these different individual relationships and also admiration for each other's work. For example, I was a big fan of George's work and had met him and talked to him casually, but I had not been able to sit in the space and just kind of get an understanding of, how great of a guy he was and how sensitive he was about the material and how sincere he was. So those really help to enhance our conversations and help us grow. But I feel like in many ways, it's really interwoven into the book. We reminded ourselves of what it might be like to talk to colleagues about this work, to really work through those difficult conversations. So you see that and I think it's not only is it woven in, but it's repeated. You know, we see reminders that when you're thinking about the equity leadership team, for instance, think about a diverse team of folks who don't have the same viewpoints. When you approach this concept of resistance, don't look at people as enemies necessarily. Just think that they're coming to this based on their own understanding. Give them space and grace to grow. And so we've continued to talk to each other and remind each other as we work through the book. And personally, I got the chance to be motivated at certain points throughout the work, because we still continue to do the work together, but we continue to do it individual in spaces. And I remember just in this last year, it was great to celebrate the publication of the book, because as we have more of these conversations coming online, as of last year, after the murder of George Floyd, we have more organized resistance. And we're not talking about colleagues in schools who went into education for the right reasons and just thought it would be good to be colorblind. We're talking about people who are really organized and saying that they are against the work. And some of that has been spurred from the heels of the last administration. So it meant a lot to me to come to this group and have a check-in session and just check in with my colleagues and just, you know, kind of let it all out and listen from their perspectives and their expertise. Some of what I knew, but some of which was also reaffirming that I was in a community that not only understood but cared about me and my well-being in this work.
It's really, yeah, please, Dr. Theoharis, go ahead.
I would just add a couple of things. And one is to highlight one of the points that Marc just made, is that in some ways, Sharon invited us all together to be a group. And I think it's important to highlight that, right? This kind of equity work takes leadership at all levels. That it was very intentional, that it was across race and across gender. And that goes back to the point Marc just said, is when we're developing leadership teams, right, in schools and in districts and organizations, we have to be intentional about having diverse voices, diverse experiences, because we know without that doesn't happen, right? And I think one of the strengths of this group, which I would say is one of the professional highlights of my career, was that intentionality from the beginning. And the second thing I think has just been beautiful is that we just were together, and in many ways we do what we ask people in the book to do, right? That we engage in hard topics, not with the goal of changing the world by tomorrow, right? Like our goal wasn't to start in March and in June have a book, right? Our goal was to come together, and we spent this time working as a group and working as individuals that allowed us to do much better work, that allowed us to do a book that we think will be really useful. But part of that was the intentionality, and part of that was our hair is not on fire. The work is urgent, but our hair is not on fire, and we have to develop our own skills and our own group. Otherwise, in face of how hard this work is, and in face of the resistance that Marc just talked about.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, because I think it's a question that will be on a lot of people's minds, seeing this book come out and with the amount of detail and thought that was put into this book. The timing is pretty impeccable. How did that work out that we are, you know, it's like in tech a lot, we talk about, you know, sort of just-in-time tools. As educators, we talk about just-in-time learning. How I know this group a little bit, so I know that this had been sort of this had been in the oven for a little bit, but was there anything that had to change about the production process of this book as a result of this year and where this conversation is?
We're all laughing at this because we have we have an amazing story around the timing of this book. You know, I actually don't even remember the original publication date. I don't know if my co-authors do, but one of the things that George just said is that we didn't write it with our hair on fire, right? We followed our lives. We followed the inspiration around the work. So we had deadlines, and if we didn't meet them. We didn't stress. We didn't fret. We knew it would come. And I think in that process, giving ourselves that grace, right? We understood and lived out the process that my other co-authors referred to. But I think, we had things that you can't even imagine happen during the process of writing this book. And we just kind of went with it. And I think for me, I won't share my co-authors, personal stories around what happened with them. I'll let them do that. But for me, it was inspirational to watch how people did their lives and stayed committed to the work, right? To equity work, and to our process. And that was an extraordinary piece of the trust for me. Like I do whatever for my co-authors, and it's because I feel like I got to witness close up, their commitment to doing this important work, right? Starting something and finishing it. I got to witness and be the benefactor of being in relationship with them. I mean, we've had all kinds of extraordinary things happening. We still stay the course. And so I think that the extraordinary grace and the intense graciousness that I've been afforded by working with these individuals will just stay with me forever. So, yeah, I'll let them share the process. But let's just say, at the very least, I think the book was supposed to be out a year ago, right? So the timing wasn't just by our design, but it was masterful design.
Right, right. Well, I want to two things I'm going to do. Gretchen, I'm going to stop your video for a second because I want to show the book for folks who are needing to get onto the publisher's website. It's on Amazon. It's available on Amazon. Last time I checked, it was it had already been made unavailable, which is good news. I wanted to ask Marc, who's this book for? Let's start there. And before we get into the 5 practices, I'm curious to have you all talk a little bit about who was the end reader that you had in mind when you were putting this together?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Mark. Thanks for asking. And I'll take it from kind of a perspective that may not, it won't be a surprise to my colleagues. I think the book is for those children who have been on that end of being marginalized, and some of us say minoritized, right? We were writing in mind of thinking about how is it that we can present something to leaders that will not only make them better leaders, but make them better leaders for the kids that they serve. We've seen multiple examples of kids being systematically excluded from education, and well-meaning educators on the other end of that exclusion. People who wake up every day not to do this intentionally necessary, but who may not have gotten the right kind of exposure and the right kind of education to really understand how to interpret, what may be unconscious biases around their work. So ultimately, if this book can reach those children who are being excluded from education for whatever reasons, then we're going to be in good hands. Now, obviously, it's written for those folks in school leadership. A lot of people will read it initially as being a book that speaks directly to the experiences of principals, but we generally think about leadership as being broader, not just that one person or the great man or the great person theory, because we also talk about district leadership in the book, and we give pointers that can be used by teacher leaders as well. So while it speaks to those folks, again, we're wanting those people to take this book up and apply what's in the book for the purpose of supporting those kids who have been marginalized for so many, for really, since our education system has been constructed and operating in the common era. If you're talking, Mark, I can't really hear you. Sounds like you're way down in the bottom.
That's a it's a highly technical process back here in the control room. It's a mute button that I was not pushing.
No problem.
So George, I wanted to have another author chime in part because one of the brilliant things about this group, I think, is the experience that is balanced by both the sort of space in higher education and academia that you all sort of serve in one capacity. There's also a lot of experience on the ground. And I just wanted to get another perspective. You know, who do you think of when you think when you saw the book on the shelf? Who was it that you most hope picks it up?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I'm going to echo a lot of what other Mark said. You know, having worked this long together, sometimes we actually have the same thoughts, which is, you know, a blessing to share thoughts with Marc Gooden. My hope is that this is picked up by leadership teams. And we have, like Mark said, an expansive view of what leadership teams are, but most K-12 schools these days have a leadership team. And often sometimes it's just administrators, sometimes it's administrators and teacher leaders. And most school districts in this country have a leadership team, whether it's the superintendent and her executive cabinet or a bigger team than that. But we really envision this book as a book that those teams do together. I mean, obviously there's words in this book, so it involves reading, but it's really a doing book. You know, it has lots of reflection. It has tons of links, right? And you know, QR codes and additional resources to make it a 21st century experience, because you can't capture all of the work that someone should do on a topic as broad as race or as wide as disability, you know, in a certain set of pages, right? So we want the team to do the hard work, but we want them to do it together, right? So like I said, there's activities, there's reflections, there's things that take you out of the book to other videos, to other activities, to things like that. But yeah, we envision this as a book that leadership teams do and sort of do again. It's not a checklist that we read once and we set down. One of our visions for this book was there are lots of people who do great work with schools and districts, like all four of us have done as consultants. And sometimes you get a little momentum and then the consultant leaves and the district, the superintendent, the principal is like, well, now what, right? And so we partly framed this book as this is a process that the team can engage in and can engage in over and over and over again to sustain this work. So it's not one and done, right? It's not like we did equity one year and next year we're not going to do equity. Right? That it's really designed to do together and not set aside and do it again.
Yeah. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, given your experience, George, is you know, I think that when there is data in the book, there's a wonderful first couple of chapters where you all just give a really solid set of data about what the composition of education leadership looks like. And I think, you know, it may be hard to believe for some, certainly not this group, but there are certainly a lot of education leaders out there who are white, who may still find this to be a really hard, you know, sort of look away from this work, in part because they don't know where to get started, or in part because they're intimidated by what it means to really sort of come forward into this work in a serious way. Can you speak to them a little bit and tell us what about this book can help sort of invite that person in and help make this everybody's work?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's sort of the $1 million question, right? Is how do we take this up and how do we do it? Whether we're brand new to it or it's been part of people's, you know, career legacy for decades. But speaking specifically to the people who are not sure this is their work, or this isn't why they came into a school leadership, or they might see the issues, but like not sure what to do, afraid, know that this is really hard, don't feel like they have the language or skills. That's part of the reason we wrote this, right? As much as it is content, it's process. And so the 5 practices, which I know we're going to get into, sort of build on each other to scaffold that process from making this your work, which is the first practice, building all the way to sort of getting to systems change and sustaining the work, which is the fourth and fifth practices. And so part of this work does, what we hope this book does, is it provides process to do this. It provides learning to do together, because you can't do this work alone, right? So you have to have community, you have to have a team, and it also provides language. One of the things that makes this work hard for people who equity work is not what brought them to the field, or they haven't done it for decades, is we often don't have the language. We don't, rarely in schools do we have the language to have cross-racial conversations in mixed race groups, right? White people tend not to have those words to have those conversations in their mouths, right? People who haven't wrestled with issues of LGBTQ or disability tend not to have language to have thoughtful conversations, to be able to engage ourselves in that practice. And so part of what this does is it's a process, part of what it does is collective learning, and part of what it does is it gives us language and strategies to use.
Okay, so here we are at the practices. I also want to say, I think we've actually timed this pretty well. I understand the Facebook feed is kind of in and out. For folks who might be having trouble on Facebook, I would encourage you to go over to NAP's YouTube channel and watch it there. Also, all of this recording will be pieced together and put onto our YouTube channel, so I'm not too worried that you miss it. But in case you are joining us and have been having trouble connecting, I want to get into the practices. So practice one, you just sort of started with, George. Can someone take practice one and just sort of walk us through the high level before we all go out and buy the book and read it?
Yeah, and I think, Mark, I'll start with practice one, and we'll be pretty brief on each one, but feel free to ask us questions, because we can certainly go deeper if that would be helpful. But practice one is prioritizing equity leadership. And in this practice, we really do two things. We're making the argument that inequity is systemic, right? That it's been built, socially constructed over 4 levels, that it's historical, institutionalized, structural, and individual, interpersonal. We have that on 1 level. And we're making the point that this is how the system of inequity works. And so often we have inequity at, think about inequity as at 1 level. For example, we think of maybe individuals as being racist, but not a system as being racist, or we think about it at a different level, but we don't think about it across levels. So we want people to think about in educational inequity across these levels, and that the getting towards equity, we have to address all 4 levels as well. And then we go into a chapter that we talk about the stories we tell. And we call it the stories we tell about why we don't do better. And really, this is a set of excuses that we have heard and stories about why schools don't do better at educating all kids and including and supporting all kids in their educations. And so we really take up these stories and want people to consider where they see themselves in them. And we provide data about the inaccuracy of some of these stories, and then really encourage people to think, personally connect in how they might act to create equity if these stories are ones that they have been telling. And so that really is practice one. Seeing inequity as a system and examining the excuses why we don't do better. And that's really prioritizing us to recognize that this is such an important issue and we need to do something differently.
So I'm gonna try not to ask you questions about each one of the practices, because I wanna be on time here for this. And can somebody let's get into, we have 5 practices. Number 2.
All right, I'll talk about practice 2. So practice 2 is what we call preparing for equity, or the sort of ongoing emotional and intellectual work of equity leadership. So this practice is really about committing to our own work and then doing it over and over and over again. This is actually the longest part of the book. It has the most pages, because we see it as perhaps it is foundational to what you're going to do in practice 3 and practice 4. By itself, it's insufficient, but builds on 3 and 4. So it's about doing our own work over and over again. It's for people who are new to equity work. and it's for those of us who have spent our careers struggling this, right? It's about all of us committing to that sort of work, right? Because we know most educators, right, most teachers, most administrators, most consultants come to this work to do good. But we have to wrestle with the realities that well-intentioned people contribute all the time to systemic inequity and systemic inequality. And then we see this as requiring us to do our own ongoing emotional and intellectual work, right? So as an example, if you take school discipline, good people in quotes, right, see behavior issues in students of color, low-income students, and students with disabilities that they do not see with white students or middle-class students or students without disabilities. Good teachers, we know teachers respond to those behaviors more harshly. We know good administrators give disparate consequences, and on, right? So it's the individual is part of the systemic racism, the systemic ableism that happens, which is why we have to do our own work. But we see this work as being ongoing, right? Over and over and over again. And so we argue that there are sort of key concepts and guiding principles that set up this work, but then this section of the book, this practice really gets into a set of identity groups that we have to do our work around: race and disability and income and language and sexual orientation and gender identity and religion. And so we have sections in part of this book about doing those kind of work. And we see this work as foundational for ourselves, but then it leads to what is practice 3 and what is practice 4.
Yeah, I'm actually open to chapter right now, chapter 8, that is exploring identities through sex, gender identity, and sexual identity. So I love that about it. That this is all. I mean, it is. I think it's easy. A lot of folks who are new to some of these ideas can get very overwhelmed by the intersectionality of some of this conversation. I found the layout here to be extremely accessible. The examples were solid, and it just helped to be fully sort of in context for this conversation, you know, from folks who have been on the ground and know what these conversations are going to look like in a school setting or among educators. So we're on to practices 3 and 4. You were Captain Segue there, George. Does somebody have 3 teed up?
Yes, I'm going to talk about practice 3. So thank you for saying what you just did, Mark, because I think it really speaks to what we were attempting to do in the first and second parts. And so practice 3 is really developing equity leadership teams. That's the practice. And thinking about the work that we pull together for 1 and 2 is really that individual work where you are in conversation with the literature, we're offering some language, and then practice 3 is really, okay, so now everyone on the team has done this individual work where we've looked at these categories, so how do we come together? And so practice 3 offers tools and approaches that can help individuals develop skills as a team focused on equity. And so we offer 4 important critical things as a part of your teamwork. And the first is creating and expanding and strengthening diverse relationships. So a lot of practice 3 really looks at what it is the process of what it is we do on teams and the important foundational work that's needed to do that. So relationships are critical. We also talk about transforming the use of power, which essentially, we have these hierarchies everywhere we go, and we defer to people who are in a higher position. And then we also sort of think of when we don't do things properly around power, that there are punitive consequences. And so we really are asking teams to think about how power is used in their group. And we also then have them thinking about how they think about data. So how they integrate personal experiences with systems and trend data. And so earlier you spoke about, people who may not have, who may come into leadership without really sort of thinking about equity as a central component of their work, because that's really not their lived experience. But we have lots of data that demonstrates that this is, the a critical issue in education. And so we talk people through, how do you on a team deal with your personal experiences, which are real, which we want you to be mindful of, alongside the system's data. And then how do we look at assessing the credibility of data? Like, how do we know which data points are real? And so we talk about how you can talk about what's credible, what's valid, and what's complete. And so we do that as a part of teamwork. And then we also offer roles for folks. And in the roles that we talk about, like, how do you be a consistent learner? How do you listen? How do you reflect on your practice, your professional practice? Also, how do you champion equity? Like, how do you increase your and others' awareness of equity on the team? And then also decision-making. How do you create authentically inclusive approaches to making decisions? And so here we're really working on the teamwork and thinking about, how do you fine-tune and continue and process around working in groups, moving from individual to the system piece.
Shall I jump right in, Mark, and go on with practice 4?
Sorry about that. Gretchen, do you mind just muting? There you go. We were getting a little bit of feedback, normal virtual life kind of stuff, but that's perfect. Mark, yeah, that would be terrific. Let's get into 4.
Absolutely. So practice 4 is really bringing things back around to the process of building. So we entitled it Building an Equity-Focused System, Identifying Needs and Planning for Systemic Change. So you're going to hear some of those connections as Gretchen was coming out of practice 3, talking about this engagement around data. And one thing I'll say, there are 4 pieces that sort of build around this building an equity-focused team. And I'll just give that away up front, because it actually formed a nice acronym I wasn't expecting, which is CAPE: collecting data, analyzing data, planning for change, and then enacting change. So I have Sharon to thank for some notes she created in our last presentation on that. But let's talk about collecting data. We talk about this idea of engaging with using an equity audit, which is really a systemic process of collecting and examining data, again, not individually, but with a team. So we, as you have heard now, broadly think about data, not just numbers. We think about qualitative data. We think about ways you learn about yourself, your others, and others that you're working with, and the system. Gretchen was talking about working with the equity leadership team, but being attentive to what those needs are for those folks and what they bring to this process. Moving from the collecting data, we go into analyzing data. How do we really start to build and strengthen those relationships around this process so that ultimately we'll get to a kind of a spoiler alert, making this more sustainable? Well, we learn to analyze data together. We come up with plans together. We work through and see where there are disparities together. We ask questions together. So when we start to co-create strategies, look at priorities, create those action plans, we're doing it together. And so there's a saying that people don't argue with their own data. So moving from that, we go into, how do we really plan for change? I mean, what are the steps that we do next to keep this process not only moving, but to keep it built into a way that it can become sustainable? We continue to work together to look at the data for the purpose of creating change. Perhaps you're familiar with the quote that says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So we have to remember that important quote is something that we can think about here as we face what some of those challenges are together and plan to move forward together to address those and to continue, as you heard my colleagues say, doing this over and over and over again. It becomes embedded within our system. We become folks who wake up who are really poised to push against inequity, and it becomes a part of what we do. Finally, enacting change. I love this. I think these are Sharon's words, act skillfully and cohesively. Working with people we know can be difficult. And we talked earlier about sometimes folks are going to have resistance to this. It's not always personal. It's just that people haven't had a chance to engage around equity across in multiracial spaces. So there's a natural resistance that society helps us kind of keep at the forefront. And we all really work within this space and are impacted by this cultural thumbprint. You know, we all exist within these inequitable systems and tend to embrace them, you know, almost unconsciously as the right way of doing, you know, business. So again, collecting data, analyzing data, planning for change, and enacting change as you know, really concrete steps toward building an equity-focused system. So I'll stop there and we'll go to 5, which I think Sharon is going to circle back and talk about.
Before we do, my buddy Dee Chambliss. Dee is an incredible member of the NAF network. She works with me on the research team, and I have Dee's asking. She loves the equity audit. Is it available in the book? Yes, it sure is.
It is. It is available in the book. We and we want to say that there are also some other tools that are available. And what's there is pretty comprehensive. You can use certain aspects of it. It's customizable. But yes, it is available in the book.
Great. I also want to ask, Dee reminds me to ask an important question, which is, she does some incredible work. We have started an initiative at NAF in the last year around participatory action research. And we're doing a lot of work with young people to try and think about how their voice works in the context of change like this. I'm wondering if you'll share some thoughts and in where in the book might somebody who's interested in getting young people involved in that kind of change turn to sort of work that into an action plan, or think about as they're auditing for equity, think about using young people, partnering with young people as a tool for change?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We think if you're going through the 5 practices, you know, that really presents an opportunity for folks to be more aware of how they engage with young people, and then, you know, really how they think through some of the work. So we talk about collecting data. For example, you may consider collecting data using a focus group with young people in the school. We don't speak specifically to youth participatory action research, but it is something that I think that is open to folks thinking through, and we just don't give the specifics of doing it. So my colleagues may have, you know, certainly some other thoughts on that, but I would take is engaging with these processes certainly make leaders more aware and engage in multiple people on the team. And so I'll say finally, having worked with some districts that are created equity leadership teams, and one district that's using a district-wide diversity, equity, and inclusion advisory committee, they have, as a result of working with me and using points from the book, come to the conclusion that young people need to be involved in those processes. And so they are part of the district level process, and they're doing their own work. And in fact, I was just with some young people a few nights ago. And so we find a number of young people today, as you know, are interested in DEI work and are interested in engaging. And then last but not least, I think once leaders become a little more aware of the work and comfortable with working through change, they can feel better about young people participating. It may sound odd for some of us, but there are leaders who are anxious about young folks getting involved and engaging around this work, and even exercising their First Amendment rights, so to speak. And I think that's the consequence of what we've learned. We sometimes become nervous because we feel like young people are going to protest and disrupt the school environment, and we cling to order. But I think that leaders who have gone through this process want to make sure that those voices are included, and will be not naturally, but predisposed to doing more of that as a result of going through these processes and being more collaborative in that approach. So suffice to say, I would be surprised if people went through our book and say, ooh, I'm really anxious about collaborating with young people.
Yeah, I hope not. I think we're on practice 5.
That's me. I'm up again. So practice 5 is the shortest practice in the book, which may seem at odds because it's about sustaining equity leadership and equity movement over time. But we really make the distinction between the sorts of action planning that you do in practice 4. So in practice 4, again, as Marc said, this process of gathering data, analyzing it, and determining action to move forward. And that's really what we might think about as technical change or action planning or that sort of thing. But practice 5 is focused on sustainability. And that's thinking about really how do we bake this into the system so that it becomes institutionalized in the way that we do things. So we literally offer a table to fill out in the book. And it thinks about change and sustainability at 3 levels: at this level of self or individual, at the level of teams, and then at the level of visions in the work. Like, sort of what are we doing and what are we doing at the organizational level? And then it takes you across 4 domains that we want you to think at each of these levels in these domains. So clear values: what are the values that are driving your commitment to the work and how do you enact them through your leadership? The second domain is learning and reflection. So really, how are you going to continue your learning and reflection? And we've talked repeatedly about how this is a process that's over and over again, that we do over and over again. But one of the most important parts of that process is ongoing learning, that you have to stay engaged with continuing to learn. Things change over time. The most sensitive forms of language, for example, changes over time. You have to learn new terminology and be flexible about that. But also, just more information becomes available, and things evolve. And so we can't know it all. So we just have to keep learning, and a practice of learning and reflection. Then there's how are we going to stay in a loop of continuous improvement? Right? So that we're not just creating a checklist saying we did it and moving on to the next thing, but maintaining a process of continuous improvement. And then the last domain is really paying attention to the human nature of this work, that at the end of the day, this work is about human beings, how we treat one another, how we relate together, how we care for ourselves, and how we care for one another. And so we have to think intentionally about how we're going to pay attention to the human nature of the work. And so that's what practice 5 is. And it's really intended for people to plan over time in 1, 5, and 10-year increments, how they're going to sustain their leadership through infrastructure and practices in their district.
Yeah. So here's my I mean, it would be $1 million idea if I wasn't going to donate it to you all, who in turn are going to donate it to all your readers. My idea was, so I have the very good fortune of having been vaccinated. And in my county where I live in New Jersey, we have the vaccine app that I know a lot of geographies are using as well. Here, my dog really likes it in the background. I don't know if you can hear her. But it's been checking in with me after my second shot periodically, right? And it gives me a 1 day after, 3 days after, and it just so happened that it coincided with me preparing for this conversation. And I thought to myself, what would it look like if chapter practice 5, which is all about planning into what's to come, if there was an app for that not only for the education leader, but also showed up on their teammates and staff's space as well, where they could just sort of check in and say, like, how are we doing on these equity goals? How does this look in the classroom? How is this looking at our staff meetings? And really just have that continuous improvement data in a regular way. That was my, as I was looking at this thing related to COVID, I thought, man, it could, no question, it's not as simple as being reminded, but I do think that there's a lot of power to making the commitment to sort of have your phone buzz every 3 days to check in and know whether or not you're meeting your goals. So anyway, that was my idea. Y'all can, when
That's
you get
a great idea. That's a great idea.
5 practices.
That's
the
great.
App. I want it.
Yeah.
I want in.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So I wanted to, we're right at the top of the hour, and I want to respect everybody's everybody's time. I do want to ask a kind of final question to see if you all will weigh in. I want to ask, what is for you all, Gretchen, training incoming educators and mid-career educators as well. For those of you who are doing consulting with schools, et cetera, the question is, in these contexts, what's the mistake you see come up over and over, that if you could wave a wand and sort of course correct, feels most significant to you right now? I'll start with you, Gretchen.
Yeah, I think, and I had this conversation with Sharon actually this morning. We do these kinds of check-ins with each other as well. And I think the piece right now that I'm struggling with the most is people are now, I would say, in March of 2021, I engage with people most of the time who are more aware of inequities, right? So we always have had the folks who are just not interested in this, who may see systems and are totally fine with the systems as they are, right? And so that's one group. But I find myself more and more encountering people who are all of a sudden, and I'll use the term that the young folks use, woke, right? And they see things now that they hadn't seen prior to Mr. Floyd's murder, for example, or just prior to all of the hate that has been put upon Asian Americans. So they are aware. And what I see right now is people who expect this work to happen overnight. They expect the entitlement and the privilege that they've had in other spaces to be a part of this equity work. And so they are quick to make decisions. They are, in my opinion, arrogant about what they know. They are incensed that people are still learning, right? They're all of these things that they are as they're coming into the work. And so for me, it's another level of awareness, right? Without having done what we think is what we put forth in chapters 1 and 2, is this real deep dive into the self-work. And so if I could give people more patience and more time to really do the self-work, right, before they attempted to fix everybody else, that's what I would, as a kid, I used to watch Bewitched, the sitcom, the TV show, and I would twinkle my nose and give everybody, the more patience and more time to do that self-work so that they wouldn't put upon other people the thing that they imagine themselves as fixing. So.
Others? It's hard to follow Bewitched.
Yeah.
Man.
I can follow Gretchen, and I may be saying what I won't know. I think I may be saying what she said in just a different way, but this idea that I already know about equity, and I've been doing it, and we actually have this in the chapter on the stories we tell. Like, I've done my work, I have the outcomes to prove it, and I don't need to do this anymore. I think, for me, having, this is the area of my scholarship. I've done, research in this area for years. And prior to that, it was a focus of my school leadership. So I've got a few decades into my learning, and I continue to learn things. And I think we make the point over and over again, but it can't be said enough that we have to step back from certainty and step back from rigidity and step into curiosity, no matter where we are, how long we've been doing this work, what our identity is. But particularly, I'm speaking to other white people, that part of being white is being shielded from these realities and easily being shielded from them, and having the privilege not to recognize them. And so I'm speaking primarily to white educators, but we have to keep doing our work. We have to keep learning. We don't know enough. And so that would be the thing that I think, the mistake that I think we need to correct, and in doing so also abandon our attachment to technical fixes for complex social constructions and problems.
Yeah, I love what you said. I put it up there. Step back from certainty and step into curiosity is a beautiful way to think about it. Does anyone want to share a last word before we close the talk for today? I want to thank everybody for the time. I'm going to try to get this. Let me get the book back up here.
I want to say, Mark, while you're doing that, I just want to say thank you so much for hosting us. We're really thrilled to get the invitation, and it's so, and I think I can speak on behalf of all of us that your appreciation for the book and all the kind words that you said about it are really heartwarming for us. We feel like it has a lot to offer, and to some way it's what we're putting out there in the world, but we're really glad and grateful for your appreciation of it, and I just want to say thank you for that.
Well, it's my pleasure to have you all here. It's an honor. I feel like it is my job to in part what we are trying to do in the research and tech team at NAF is to close the gap between the big ideas that end up in the hands of researchers and make sure they're in the hands of every practitioner, and make sure that this best thinking about praxis and how we build new paradigms for the work. I love, we kept Gretchen kept referring to the work, and I feel like we all need T-shirts that just say like the work, just to remind us what's going on here. Anyway, I thank you all so much. I think between the group that was able to join us and the recording, we're going to have a lot of folks who are interested, and I can't wait to have you back to talk more about what the response has been. Before we go, I am going to just bring Gretchen back into the fold, and congratulations again on the book. I thank you so much for all of your hard work on it and for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.